So we're going to now hear from David Gill. I think that just about everybody knows who he is. He's, of course, the founder of the society, the International Jacques Society. In 2000, I think you should have waited till 2001. We could have put a monolith up for it. But anyway, what an extraordinary gathering, and what to say, it's beautiful. Gill, of course, has taught in the seminary, he's taught ethics, he's taught, well, three of his main concerns about his work, I think, is Ellul, certainly, and work, and faith, and community, and hope, and freedom. These are all issues that concern what he writes, and what he writes circles around Ellul. It goes to that center, but it also goes to his life. What are you going to do about it is a book worth looking at. Here, Ellul, I'm sorry. We're looking at his life, and his life is a life of commitment and a life of courage. I think courage is a huge part of this. And when you look at his autobiography, you see all of the things that he's done. I was amazed at to what extent he was gifted at manual labor, even though I saw his house and he told me he worked on it. It's great stuff. Doing things by hand, very important. His topic is the technicization of work. What has technology done to work? What is work? How does work relate to the human? How does the human relate to work? These are central questions in our society where work has become problematic, where it's problematic to wonder what it means to be human. So, David?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please remain in your seats. Yeah, I finally decided a couple years ago that I would write a memoir, and I wrote it mostly just because I wanted to reflect on my life, and secondarily for my 6 grandchildren if they are interested in Grandpa someday. But it was really good, and then I tried to think, well, what am I going to name this thing? And I thought for a long time I would call it A Marginal Life, because, being an Ellulian and everything, it puts us on the margins of our academic fields right away. Just like Jacques Ellul always felt like he was kind of marginal and a prophet from the outside. But then one day I was talking with my friends like Max Lopez Cepero, who's here, and I said, one thing I think about my life is my father, whenever I was griping about something in the neighborhood or the church or whatever it was, and I'd be griping about it as a teenager, my father would say to me, well, what are you doing about it? What are you doing about it? I know you know how to gripe. I know you're an analyst of how horrible this church is or whatever, but what are you doing about it? We asked God to give us a kid who would be able to do something. And so that's the story of my life, is answering my father's question, what are you doing about it? And so in the late 90s, Patrick Chastanet over in France and Daniel Saraswell and I and others were saying, Ellul's influences, his books are going out of print. And so, the questions in my head, well, what am I doing about it? So when I came home, I got David Lovekin and Carl and Langdon and others together, and we formed the society. But of course, that's not the whole of my life. It's not just, our doing has to come out of our being, and I saw that exemplified in my father and mother and others. And so the contemplative life is the soil out of which any meaningful active life can come. So even though my autobiography, my memoir, is not called "What Are You Being?" What are you being about it? It's what are you doing about it? But still, I believe in the being side. When I used to teach ethics all the time, I often would say, our ethics of the active life, of decision and action must come out of the virtue side of life, our character and our community. But it's not either or. It's not do or be, it's do. And so all my former ethics students, MBAs and others, they know Gill, it's do. So anyway, well, I'm going to do a little bit right now by reading you my paper. I got all fired up about it and wrote a 20-page paper, which is posted online, but I can't read a 20-page paper. I'm hoping I can read 10 pages out of the end of it. But it has 4 parts. My title is The End of Technicized Work. In other words, the impact of technology, technique on work. What's the end of technicized work? Well, I mean that, of course, as a double entendre in different ways. I mean, where is it going? As technology impacts and replaces workers, where is this process going, and what's it leading to? What can we see that is happening? And then, secondly, why is this happening? Who asked for this anyway? Why is this happening? The question of finalities that Justine and Daniel talked about also. So why is this happening? And then thirdly, I'm asking also, is there any place where this process ends in the sense that there are boundaries beyond which we could find meaningful work? So that's the agenda. I have 4 parts, and I'm only going to read parts 3 and 4. But part 1 I call From Tools to Technopoly, Neil Postman's term, where it's not just making tools, but it's in the history of work, but it's eventually machines and technology, and now to the point where work is really monopolized by technology, tools, and methods. And Jacques, I'm kind of doing a summary of Jacques Ellul's description of the history of work and the history of life, where in the beginning, our main struggle is with nature. So we live with natural necessity. Our activities during the day are to find protection, to find food and water and what have you. It's our struggle, our conditioning is from nature primarily. Second stage, and these are not discrete stages necessarily at all, but the second stage is social necessity, where we don't just work when we're hungry, but we might not work on the Sabbath day. We don't just harvest food or hunt on any land, but only on lands that are not sacred lands. So there are these social constraints within which we work. So natural necessity, work within natural necessity means we stop at night because it's dark. Social necessity, we stop on the Sabbath day because it's our tradition not to do that or not, But with technology, we can work as long as the lights are on, or our computers are hooked up, as long as natural necessity comes in because we're exhausted, that kind of thing. But I kind of outlined that threefold history and end by talking about work in a world of technological necessity. That's part 1. And here's the conclusion at the end of that. Work is an essential activity of human life. It has always involved the invention and use of tools and techniques. Work has been constrained and guided by nature's reality and by social traditions and values. The development and linking together of all these tools, machines, and ever more powerful technologies now not only serves work, but has become the environment, the milieu, even the master of human work. The servant has become the master. Thoreau's worry that we might become the tools of our tools has largely come true. That's part 1. Part 2 is about where is this going? And in this part, a lot of my best sentences, but actually I'm kidding you, But in this part 2, I quote from a book called The Rise of the Robots by Martin Ford, a Silicon Valley techie who wrote a history of robotization and where it's going. It's just incredible what's happening and where that's going. I also quote from recent reports from McKinsey Global, the big research consulting firm, and from the World Economic Forum on what's happening to our jobs and what's predicted. And the predictions are that, 80%, 90% of all of our existing jobs are going to be technicized, robotized. And so So the question is, so I think clearly we're moving in that direction. And so the question is, in that part two, is what are the impacts? The two main things that I talk about are the economic impacts and also the human impacts. And now I'm drawing more on Ellul when I'm talking about that. Here's the summary of part two. The trajectory of the technicization of work is leading toward massive change in the way work gets done, with technologies replacing the initiative and labor of vast numbers of workers. The technician class should thrive, but most other jobs will be as the retrained and adapted servants and appendages of machines. Income inequality will continue to vastly increase, unemployment and underemployment will rise, but workers will also be dehumanized by technically mediated relationships in the workplace, whatever remains, and also the loss of opportunity to engage in creative, meaningful work. That's on page 11. Now, I'm going to begin to read now on part 3, which is the ends of technicized work. Why is this happening? What's the reason? What's the purpose for this? The end of technicized work in the sense of where its development is leading is pretty clear. Unless there is a true rebellion or awakening or catastrophe or revolution in our society's direction and values. For such a revolution to have any chance, we need to shift our inquiry to an exploration of the end or ends of technicized work in a sense of the causes or the motivating purposes and goals. Why is this wholesale technicization of work happening? Who asked for the replacement of human agents like bank tellers, post office workers, taxi drivers, customer service humans, etc.? Who asked for that? Who asked for more computer apps, endless updates, and more personal info-based algorithm-generated junk messages assaulting us? Who asked for this anyway? It's certainly true that in today's technologies, including personal computers, the internet, it's certainly true that many of those have enabled an amazing burst of creativity and entrepreneurship. Countless individuals and companies have been enabled to embrace socially positive purposes and deliver good products and services. This is technology in the service of human survival and flourishing. It does seem like it's possible for individuals and companies to set ethical limits on their uses of technology and keep it to a human scale, even while their technological platforms and infrastructures are ruled by the larger players and their own arrested set of values. But the mega machine rolls on, storming through workplaces like everywhere else. Why is this happening? A couple decades ago at a conference I attended, which I think was the one Carl organized at Penn State, Neil Postman told at the table like this of a story of trying to buy a new car to replace his old beater. In the showroom, the salesperson proudly showed Neil the new automatic window controls. We're talking 70s or 80s here. The new automatic window controls. And Neil said, well, I'd like a model with the traditional manual roll-up windows, roll-up window cranks, but he was told they were no longer available. And so Neil asked, what is the problem that I have for which this is the solution? The salesperson, of course, had no answer, and Neil had no choice but to accept this technological advance. And I joked to him that one of the side effects would be a weaker left bicep that he'd have to put up with over the years. Well, we all have experienced innumerable technological changes, often called upgrades, but not all experienced as such. Postman's observation was about the phenomenon he called technopoly, and his question about why, for what reason or purpose, begs to be placed before every technological development. So the first reason that people give is safety, health, and even human flourishing. Many technological developments are justified by a genuine concern for human safety, for increased food production and distribution, for easier research or communication, for the care and cure of disease and injury, for the provision of shelter, for the preservation of knowledge and cultural artifacts, and so on. These are worthy ends and purposes, but we must still ask questions about effectiveness, not necessarily efficiency, and also about possible or actual costs and side effects. We also must question what Ellul called the technological bluff of humanism in the discourse about technology. Here's what he said, all in technological bluff. He says, all techno discourse either is or seeks to be discourse about humanity, about human primacy and objectives. Its theme is true human fulfillment, which it rates very highly. The more technocratic the author, the higher the rating of humanity. All technical activity orients us to a greater humanity. It is not just a matter of supplementing, but of achieving it. All technical progress is said to correspond to a basic desire of the race from the very first. All technique has human well-being as its end, allowing us fully to realize and express ourselves. So yes, some technological progress does, I'm speaking now, continue to contribute sometimes mightily to our health and flourishing. But as Ellul asks, who does it? Who does get to define what that human flourishing is really all about and human well-being? Are the architects of Silicon Valley some Illuminati who best understand this? Hardly. So beware the rhetoric, the bluff of technological discourse, which overpromises the upside and overlooks or deliberately buries the downside. But this well-being of humanity is the first thing. The second argument, justifying technology, for the technology, the end of technicizing our jobs is productivity and efficiency. For the jobs in future analysts quoted earlier, McKinsey, World Economic Forum, and others, here's the way they talk about it. Quote, here's why we technicize jobs. Higher productivity, increased efficiency, safety and convenience, workers achieving more in terms of output and productivity, higher levels of output, better quality, and fewer errors and capabilities that surpass human ability. Companies that are digital leaders in their sectors have faster revenue growth and higher productivity. Now we're getting to the money side a little bit. Their profits and margins can increase 3 times as fast. That's from McKinsey. So the primary goals, the justifications, are quantifiable productivity and efficiency resulting in increased company revenues. Now, no doubt, the use of tools and technologies throughout history has often resulted in productivity gains, but the questions remain: at what cost and by whom are these productivity gains achieved? Who are the winners and losers? What are the impacts on the earth, the global and local populations? What are the impacts on the workers? What are the long-term consequences of short-term and narrowly defined productivity? Short-term productivity may turn out to be massively inefficient in the long term. Growth is an idol that needs to be challenged by the décroissance movement, the ungrowth movement coming from France, as well as by our own Doug Hill's wonderful book, Not So Fast. In the technological bluff, Ellul challenges this productivity argument first by objecting that even the concept of productivity, of more, is not always desirable. He challenges also the claims to increase productivity by questioning their narrow criteria, their narrow methods of measurement. And he highlights at length the ignored costs and trade-offs, such as, in his language, the turning of the countryside into a desert, unemployment, the manufacturing of useless goods, and the reducing of consumption to banality, all with an appearance of ease, comfort, and health. End of quote. The idol and the claim of productivity needs to be challenged. Profits, third thing. So human flourishing, productivity, and now profits. Jacques Ellul famously argued that not capital but technique is itself the main driver of technical growth. We'll come back to that, but I think it is inescapable that greed and the unqualified quest for personal and corporate profits drives much of the development and marketing of technology. Ellul himself shows how money serves as an idol, can serve as an idol, in one of the demonic principalities and powers against which the Bible warns in his book, Money and Power. Adrian Lafrance's recent essay in The Atlantic called The Despots of Silicon Valley provides a withering critique of how the leaders of Facebook, Google, Meta, and other tech giants drive technological development out of greed, the quest for power, and disregard for the negative or unpredictable human and social impacts. What can be done will be done. What can be marketed will be marketed. And any attempts to regulate or rein in technology are fiercely opposed in the name of freedom. We believe in free enterprise, etc., which Ellul says is another instance of the technological bluff. It says somebody used the word BS or something like that earlier this morning. But even here, Ellul points also to the often ignored costs of technological development. So you talk about profits, but actually, are they really net positive economically? The companies and their executives, they may evade and paper over the costs which are externalized onto society. Vast government subsidies, infrastructures that must be built and then maintained, continuous upgrades, breakdowns, and the potential and real costs of serious risk are often ignored and downplayed. So profit is a powerful motive for the technicization of work, but profits for whom and at what cost? Finally, the technological zeitgeist. This is my final section on this. Why is this happening? So the superstar leaders of tech world must not be let off the hook, but they are riding on the tsunami of what Ellul calls technique, the dominating spirit and mindset of our age, with rationality, artificiality, quantification, the one best way, networking. So even without conscious intervention by Mark Zuckerberg or whoever, technique acts as an autonomous megaforce, self-augmenting as technical platforms and opportunities automatically lead to more technology ad infinitum. Technophile leaders insist that it's all inevitable. And actually, Jacques Ellul acknowledges that it sort of is, at least in that broad sense, unless there's a catastrophe or a mass revolt of some sort. In his 1977 book, The Technological System, Ellul devotes a really interesting chapter to causal progression and the absence of finality. Let me quote from that. Technology develops not in terms of goals to be pursued, but in terms of already existing possibilities of growth. We must ask whether in the progression of technological system, what happens? No doubt finalities emerge in the progression, but the point is that these finalities appear during the very course of the process. In other words, they are in no way directing it, they're adventitious. They're merely justifications that are tacked on because people are unwilling to lose space or appear to be subjugated to other causal mechanisms. So Ellul goes on to challenge the espoused motivations of wealth and national grandeur, etc., as finalities. And he ends by saying it's necessity which characterizes the technical universe. Everything must accommodate itself with mathematical certainty. Every successful technique has appeared because the ones which preceded it rendered necessary the ones which followed, otherwise they would have been inefficacious, etc. So to summarize this section, why is virtually all work being technicized? It's usually justified by a quest for productivity, efficiency, and profits. It's sometimes justified by concerns for health, safety, and even human flourishing, but in Ellul's convincing analysis, the progress, growth, and expansion of technology is primarily driven or caused by problems and opportunities which arise in existing technology. The process is unchallenged by the more or less global acceptance of technique as inevitable and good. So autonomy and self-augmentations are its characteristics. So then my section 4, the most exciting of all, but I only have a few minutes. Ellul has a rather bleak assessment of the fate of the worker in today's workplace. He says there's no absolute obligation for the individual to conform to the type. He can, if he will, despise it, but then he'll always find himself in an inferior position, and we're just going to be, our personal adaptability is limited, and so it's bad news for workers. And so I say, once again, let's be clear, even in the gloom, we Ellulians see some technicizing of human work and workplaces has brought benefits which we can welcome, and others we can at least tolerate. And some adaptation of our work thinking and experience to our technical milieu is understandable and adaptable. It's the total submission, the unquestioned submission of all of our work and worker to technique that's the grand problem. And he's not optimistic. We've already heard some of this. We need a general war or an act of God or something like that. But I go on to say, on the other hand, despite this bleak assessment, remember Ellul's project, a realistic understanding of the world in which we live. That's number one, is we need to understand this world. And that's over against a dialectical stance of hope and freedom in this difficult reality. A rediscovery, not only of a renewed way of thinking, but also a daily incarnation of that truth in a lifestyle. So where do we start? I love how Ellul says at the end, I think, of Technological Bluff, he says, we profit from the existence of little cracks of freedom, and we need to install in them a trembling freedom which is not attributed to or mediated by machines or politics, but which is nevertheless effective, so we may truly invent the new thing for which humanity is waiting. The problem is that men and women don't have the intellectual, moral, or spiritual reference point for judging and criticizing technology. So what do? And I suggest there are three basic things that need to happen. The first one, again, is to acquire awareness. And the more we can do to help people around us understand this sea that we live in, this milieu of technique, and what it is that we're talking about, what we're criticizing, is the unqualified universal submission to technology, not just using it here or there for particular purposes, but just allowing it to rampage everywhere. That's what we're up against. And the other side of awareness, not just awareness of the big main current, but the awareness of our neighbor. And I'd say that includes our techie neighbors. We need to get to know actual people working in technology as well as the actual people living on my street. And not just look at statistics and grand theories, but we need to know real people and eat with them and live with them and listen to them, as well as having the awareness, because it's between those two factors. It's that awareness that begins. And then secondly, here's a huge thing in Ellul. The first act of a free person is to say no. And a critical feature of all ethics and values is the notion of limits. There have to be some limits. There has to be some thou shalt not or I shall not that we set if we want to discover any freedom or any kind of ethics. So what do we say no to in our workplace? When we're teaching in a university, we can't say no to everything, but can we say no? Can we become aware of what's going on and then say no or resist? But if we do say no, we need to go to the number three thing is, what are we going to say yes to? And we often don't go there. But we can't just say no without saying, here's a better way to treat our students. Here's a better way to manage our staff in the kitchen, in our restaurant, or to manage Facebook or whatever it might be. So it's awareness, it's resistance, and then it's embrace and invention of alternatives. I just want to mention also that in an interesting note on resilience, Ellul argues that resistance requires community. He doesn't talk about community, and when I would suggest to him I wish he would say more about it, he often would say, well, I've never experienced it, so I can't really talk about it. Well, he did experience community with Charbonneau and the Saraswells, but he had a kind of more idealistic version, I guess he was thinking of. But Ellul argues that community is essential, and he gives this example from the Holocaust, and he says, in our culture, the person who's not consciously adapted to his group, meaning like a religious group or whatever it is, with their can't put up adequate resistance. In the face of the Holocaust, Zionist groups with their collective psychology were able to withstand persecution much more readily than were the Jews who had retained an individualistic mentality. So the implication is, for those of us resisting technicized work or other things, we need to find community, mission-driven, values-embedded community. We can't go back to the Middle Ages, but Ellul does point out how Christianity played a critical role that's missing today. We can't revive it, but he says in the medieval period, one side of Christianity, quote, was opposed to technical development, the moral judgment which Christians passed on all human activities. Technical activity did not escape moral judgment. The question, is it righteous, was asked of every attempt to change modes of production or organization. That something might be useful or profitable to people did not make it right and just. And we don't have that kind of framework anymore. What's it going to be where we have a narrative or a story or a myth that will help us to have a standpoint outside of technique to provide perspective? So I have just closing, I have some recommended strategies. I hope Mr. Ellul would view these with, but anyway, my first one is resistance within the system. After reading Ellul's devastating analysis of the technological system, our first reaction is often to flee, to drop out as much as possible. And short of that, it may seem like there's no option but to grimly accept technical necessity at work and hunker down. But you know, despite the iron cage and the necessity of technicized work, Ellul implies that we should not just roll over and conform. Wherever we work, whatever our job is, he says this in Technological Society, page 408, whatever it is, Ellul says, each of us in our own life must seek ways of resisting and transcending technological determinants. In every area of life, in our profession, in our relationships, we must look at it dialectically and say that people are indeed determined, but that is open to us to overcome necessity, and this act is freedom. It's not a question of getting rid of the technological phenomenon, but of transcending it. It's learning how to say no, of setting limits, but also, he says, to introduce signs of hope, freedom, and humanity. So we do not, therefore, call on all workers to drop out of technicized workplaces, not even the giants like Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. We want voices and activists of resistance and reform within these organizations, not just lobbying criticism into those workplaces from outside, although we want that too. But as Ellul argues, this means raising questions of limits. It means honest communications to customers. We can do that, and the public. It means consideration of long-term impacts and possible side effects. We want people in the technological system who will show respect and genuine care for colleagues. There's nothing stopping you from showing care, even by email sometimes, to a colleague in the most brutal kind of technological system. So we show respect and care for our colleagues and customers in otherwise brutally competitive and impersonal environments. These small acts of freedom may not seem measurably effective, but whoever said effectiveness and efficiency should decide what we do. I remember somebody saying that's not our rule. Second strategy is a vocation outside of work. Ellul's written essays on work and vocation where he says, give up on work and find a place outside of your ordinary work to express your vocation of freedom. He used to say, he wrote a few times, that his job was a professor, but his vocation was expressed in those juvenile profession clubs, and you could say his work with protecting the coast and his work with the church. He was real active with his local parish and the people there. So those were his vocations. But I asked him when I discussed it with him, I said, well, didn't you get any sense of meaning out of working with your students and creating this research? I mean, wasn't that kind of vocational too? And he said, well, yes, it was. It was. And he would kind of smile and wink, but he didn't agree with me even in the end. But I also pointed out to him, I've started a bunch of nonprofits and, done things with churches where you start out with the highest ideals and everybody's committed. But you know what? The necessity and failure all come into those nonprofits just as much. So those prevention clubs must have experienced necessity and dysfunction, just like the University of Bordeaux must have done as well. But I do think, I do agree with Ellul that sometimes for some of us, we have to find something outside of our ordinary workplace where we can more fully express the freedom that we really want, freedom and love. Third strategy is boutique work on the margins. Ellul's own prognosis was pretty grim, but while he's bleak about the whole, he notes, quote, in writing this, the Technological Society, I have of course omitted innumerable facets of our world. There are still artisans, petty tradesmen, butchers, domestics, and small landowners, but then he says this, theirs are the faces of yesterday, the more or less hardy survivals of our past, in the complexity of the present world. The residues do exist, but they have no future and are consequently disappearing. End of quote. I see the broad trend that Ellul's talking about, but I do not agree with Ellul that they have no future. I believe we need an explosion of creative small local enterprises using but not being used by technology, and there are modest signs of such life in most of our communities. Martin Ford's Rise of the Robots lists a bunch of possible jobs that people can have, and so I'll move on from there. But I do say my own urban neighborhood, let me just say also, I think human ingenuity is still incredible, and many people will find or create new kinds of jobs. Various different black market economies could arise on the fringes of our brave new world. And my own urban neighborhood in Oakland, California, is densely populated by small, independent businesses across a large number of industries and specialties. And within 2 blocks of my house, Starbucks would be like the 5th rated coffee shop because there are local ones that people prefer, and these businesses are able to survive and avoid the big mega thing. The next strategy I call political and labor initiatives. I just have 2 more. And despite the political illusion, which Ellul described at length, both in Technological Society and Political Illusion, I actually continue to believe that we should participate, but without illusions, but we should participate as is possible and appropriate, not give our lives to it. But even Ellul argued in Technological Bluff, quote, "We must make politicians, administrators, and technicians personally responsible for useless, unjust, and unsuccessful products that are shown to be such." And despite his pessimism about voting in elections, Ellul continually called out the responsible in his books and essays and his regular newspaper columns in Sud-West. So he kept pushing, on that kind of political side, and I think we should too. Without illusions, we're not going to change the world through who becomes president. They may destroy the world, but I don't think we can change it by our votes alone. But I think we could still think about advocacy and support for better environmental stewardship, accessible health care, housing availability, minimum wages, if not also universal basic income, worker and union protections, and social safety nets. We need to support data privacy initiatives and the restraint of monopolistic enterprises, regulatory wisdom, not over-regulation, but regulatory wisdom, affordable education, and free enterprise. Progress in these areas may be mediocre, slow, or even ineffective, but again, whoever said being effective or efficient was going to rule our life. Okay, my conclusion. I am done here. Revolution from the bottom. Now, this is more Gill than Ellul. But in conclusion, both within and outside the technopolized work that we've been considering, the world is waiting for people who will study and understand both technology and work realistically and in depth. So we are waiting for workers who understand their primary identity outside the technicized work milieu, in humanistic, if not also theological terms. We're waiting for workers who are educated broadly beyond the STEM obsessions of our age. Workers who adhere to a robust mission and purpose and are sustained in a vibrant, value-embedded community, however small that may be. So let me close by reminding you that it is not just the powerful in our society who always have the last word. Here are a few examples. Back in the 1960s, 50s and 60s, San Francisco Bay, where I live, was a stinking, toxic mess, with factories and cities dumping their raw sewage and filling the edges of the bay with municipal dumps before building more factories and some luxury housing developments. The bay was dying and disappearing. Nobody could eat a fish out of San Francisco Bay. Nobody should stick their foot in San Francisco Bay. Today, San Francisco Bay is clean. The fish are edible. You can walk. There are bike paths and walking paths around the edges of the bay. There are restored wetlands. They flourish. How did this happen? How did this happen in my lifetime? Well, it wasn't by technological initiatives, I can tell you. It was not corporate benevolence. It was not political sensitivity and insight. It was 3 Berkeley women up on the hill looking out on San Francisco Bay who launched a small movement called Save the Bay. And this movement began to grow as more and more individuals saw how important this was to save the bay from developers and toxicity and all that. And it succeeded not through propaganda, but by awakening consciences. It stirred imaginations. It mobilized enough voters and activists, and it became irresistible. Secondly, a true coffee revolution in terms of quality, availability, and congenial social meeting spaces has actually changed American culture. I know it may seem small, but it's actually huge. That we actually have coffee shops everywhere to sit around and talk with actual good coffee to drink. It didn't used to be that way. And how did this happen? Well, it didn't start from the coffee industry like Hills Brothers or MJB. It started from small coffee shops in Berkeley and in Seattle. And because people loved it, it was true, it was real, it began to expand. Now, of course, Starbucks now is a big mega corporation, and Pete's as well. Those were the origins. But I'm just saying you could start very small, and it can have a real impact on the way people live. A third example, whether you like it or not, is hip-hop music and dress. You know, I thought about wearing my pants down around my butt here, but just to illustrate, but I couldn't do it. My wife wouldn't let me out of the room. But hip-hop music and dress, like it or not, began not in the big music and fashion houses. It began among youth, disaffected youth on the street corners of Watts and elsewhere in economically depressed neighborhoods. But it captured the imaginations. It captured the imaginations, and it became an irresistible thing, whether we like it or not. So it's small things can just have incredible impact sometimes. Fourth, I have just two more examples. Fourth, the civil rights movement, I want to mention, did not begin in Congress in the United States. It didn't begin with a good conscience of corporations. It began in small black churches. It began in small black churches, in local restaurants, in busing systems. It began in some classrooms. It began in some small jazz and blues clubs where people expressed justice and freedom with their bodies and their lives. It didn't begin in Congress, and it never would have, but it succeeded because it was true. It was right. People were willing to pay for it and live out their freedom. And then finally, one example that I love, as you might imagine, is Christianity did not start with Jesus running for emperor or for king or founding a big organization. He started out with a handful of disciples who thought of each other as brothers and sisters, and they were embracing and demonstrating a radically new way of life and thought. And yes, there was a lot of pain and suffering along the way, but they stuck with it, and within 2 centuries, the whole Roman Empire was rocking and rolling. So my final sentence is, do not be discouraged. Awareness, resistance, purpose, creativity, and community in our work, as in all other aspects of life. Let us find those cracks of freedom that Ellul talked about and think globally, but act locally. Thank you. Oh man,
Well, the embodiment of hope, freedom.